Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Black Doctoral Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Brian Daniels, and I will serve as today's moderator. Before we start today's session, I want to first encourage you to ask questions, be engaged with the presentation. You can post your questions in the chat or hold your questions until the end of the presentation. Likewise, I'd like you to complete a brief evaluation at the end of the session. I will place a link to that evaluation, to that survey evaluation in the chat. So without further ado, we'll get started. The title of today's presentation is An Introduction to APIs for Big Data Assembly and Research. And our speaker is Dr. Jessica Coates. Dr. Coates is a health data scientist with over 8 years of experience conducting data analytics in academic, industry, and government settings. She has subject matter expertise in data collection and assembly, open science initiatives, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Over the course of her career, she has been able to apply these skills to research studies in microbiology, public health, responsible and inclusive technology, and public policy. Outside of science, Dr. Coates is an avid reader, and she loves to travel. Dr. Coates, welcome. The microphone is now yours.
Awesome, thank you so much. So first, I'm going to share my slides in the chat for everyone so that you can have access to follow along. And I will also share my screen so that we can get started. All right, perfect. So we have the slides in the chat. Also, if you all would like my contact information on that first slide, I have 2 emails that you can reach me at, as well as I love to make new contacts on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out on that platform as well if you're interested. But with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started with our talk today, which is basically an introduction to application programming interfaces, or I'll call them APIs for short, and how they can be used for data collection. So Dr. Daniels already gave such a wonderful introduction. So I'm just going to kind of expand upon that just a little bit. I earned my PhD in biomedical and biological sciences from Emory University. And while I was at Emory, I took, I guess, what people would call a non-traditional approach to understanding infectious diseases and microbiology, but I decided to collaborate between multiple different departments. So I worked with biophysicists to understand how individual bacteria replicate in the presence of antibiotics, and what alternative treatment strategies we could develop through a mathematical model to really help clear those infections in some patients that were persistent. But then on the other side of things, I wanted to understand how the mumps virus replicates in a population when we have different vaccinations in place. And so when you're doing that type of research for a lot of ethical reasons, which I'm sure you all probably understand, especially coming from African-American perspectives, we can't expose individuals to certain infectious agents and then just see what happens. That's not ethical, nor is that responsible as a scientist. So I had to rely on already collected data from other people and how I could assemble that information to answer some of my research questions. After finishing my PhD, I did a postdoc or visiting scholar position at IBM on their responsible and inclusive technology team. And we were really interested in understanding things like how the digital divide and digital inequity impacted communities long term. When we were doing this type of research, many of the questions that we were wanting to answer, there wasn't data necessarily available. So we had to figure out how to utilize our different resources to be able to collect information. And that's when I happened upon and became more familiar with the use of APIs. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. And since we have a relatively small group, hopefully we can be pretty interactive and not so overly formal with me just talking at you all the entire time. So if you all are doing research, then you're probably familiar with a lot of different ways to collect data. In my research journey, I started with doing manual data curation, which was basically, I was conducting experiments, I was going online and trying to download files, copying and pasting, and really trying to assemble that final data set that could answer the questions I was interested in using Excel. As I got a little bit more advanced in my data science skills, I became familiar with what's called web scraping. And while it is sometimes done manually, instead, what you'll do with web scraping is you'll use a system of algorithms or a line of code to actually have the computer automatically go through a website, scan the most useful information, and extract it into really usable data files. When we use both of these methods, they come with a lot of pros and cons. So for example, I'm not sure if anyone in the audience has ever done manual data curation. It gives you the full control over what the final data set looks like. So you don't have to worry about whether or not you will be able to do your analysis downstream because you have control over what's going into it. But it's also a very timely manner to be able to do this manual curation. And I will acknowledge in my past, I've made a lot of errors in doing some of this manual curation. For example, not too long ago, I had to assemble data manually from the Department of Public Health in my state. And as I was doing this information and doing this assembly, I started doing some analysis downstream. And it was telling me that in a lot of the counties that I was interested in, there was at least 33 or more % of the population was Asian American. And now, if you're familiar with population dynamics in the United States, and specifically within the rural South, that should be a little bit alarming, right? We don't typically see that large of populations. And what it came to be is that in my copy and paste, I copy and pasted some information into the wrong column. And so I had to go back, redo that data analysis. And it kind of cost us a little bit of time in trying to get this information together for downstream grant applications, as well as for a website that we're trying to develop. On the other hand, you can use web scraping. Web scraping is really fast, it's pretty efficient, and you really don't run into those same errors that you do when you're doing manual curation. And something that's also really nice with web scraping is that it's a lot cheaper a lot of times than doing your own experiments and having to spend more of your time or hiring people on your team to be able to do that manual curation. On the other side, learning web scraping is not that easy. It has a pretty big, large learning curve. You have to make sure that you know some sort of previous language. Most of the times, if you're doing a lot of web scraping, you're going to use something like Python and R. And for those in the audience, if you're familiar with them, it takes a little bit of time just to be able to learn how to write code in those particular languages. And something about those web scraping tools and algorithms is that they're constantly changing and being updated. And so as they're being updated and changed, you have to make sure that your code is maintained and that your code is being updated as well. And then last but not least, a lot of websites, and nowadays, especially as we're doing big data assembly and big data research, a lot of websites and organizations know the value of data. And so with these web scrapers, oftentimes you're using an open source programming language and you're assembling this data for free. And so a lot of organizations have actually developed ways to kind of block web scraping and make sure that if you want to assemble data from their organization, you're going through the avenues that they suggested or that they have control over. And so in my research experience, I learned a third method, which was APIs. And when we use APIs as researchers, it gives us the opportunity for an alternative method for data collection. So you're probably wondering what exactly is an API, because that's what I wondered when it was suggested to me in my postdoc that I use them to be able to collect data. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And as far as its official definition, it's a set of definitions and protocols that allow a user to query a resource, retrieve that data, and then download the data in a machine-readable format. One API that we all have, or at least I'm pretty certain majority of us have and rely on, is the weather app. So when you open up the weather app on your phone, it shows you what the weather should look like for today, moving forward for the rest of the week. And it gives you a really detailed understanding. But in order for that app to display that information, it has to have some sort of background talking with the Weather Bureau database to pull that information and then display it for you to see. And so in the world of APIs, people commonly use this example of thinking about the API like a waiter. So as a customer, you go to a restaurant, you have an order and you want that order to be delivered to the chef. But in order for it to be delivered to the chef and make sure that what you get back is exactly what you asked for, you have to go through the waiter, or in our case would be the API. So as a research scientist, you're interested in getting certain information from an organization, and you want to make sure you get the correct information, accurate information. And the way that you're going to do that is through using your API. And there's lots of different ways as research scientists that we can utilize APIs. So to begin, most of the scholarly journals that you're going to use in your research all have APIs available for you to be able to download collections of text that may be related to your research topic. Some commonly used APIs include the Biomed Central Journal, the IEE Explore API. We also have PLOS, Science Direct, Springer, and JSTOR, just to name a few. Another great initiative that has been going on recently in the United States since the COVID-19 pandemic is data modernization. So many government organizations that collect information, they're now making that information readily available for research scientists through the use of APIs. So some examples of that include the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Energy, Human Health Services, and many more. And actually today, in the example that we talk about, we're going to use the US Census Bureau's API to collect a little bit of population data. And then another thing is when we go outside the United States, there's a lot of global entities and major news networks that have APIs now so that we can download information from them and some of the publications that they may have. So for example, when I was working on my dissertation work, I was really interested in outbreaks. And when we're in the science world, as many of you know, there's a kind of delay between the time when we collect the information and the time that it's gone all the way through the peer review process and it's finally published. But when we have certain sources like maybe the New York Times, their publication process isn't as stringent as peer review, but it is still pretty reliable and it happens at a much quicker scale. So if there was any major news or outbreaks that were currently happening and I wanted to get an idea of what was going on, I could use some of the APIs for major news networks to be able to do that. So today we're going to kind of do a quick walkthrough of using an API, but there's not many people on the call, so maybe we can also explore some of the research projects that you all are engaging in at the conclusion of this and see if we can identify some really useful APIs. So for today, I just wanted us to do something relatively simple, but trust me, it can get much more complex and address many more of your research needs. But I just wanted us to be able to use an API to kind of assemble population data for each state in the United States in 2019. And so in order to do this, I have to be able to figure out what API I can use and where I can find them. One of the quickest and easiest ways, I think, is through using a search engine approach. So we have the wonderful source or tool of Google. And so what we can kind of do is if we know our research topic, we can type that into our search engine plus the word API, and it will return a list of APIs that are probably relevant to what we're looking at. Another option that we have, and that I think is really wonderful as you're engaging in research, is to know your university resources, and specifically to know about your university's library. Within the library, there's probably going to be a data librarian or a data science librarian now that we're getting more into the big data and assembly age. And so you can schedule a consultation with that individual and let them know what your research needs are, and they can likely guide you in the direction of which APIs to use. Additionally, your university's website, library website, probably already has an amazing list of APIs that are commonly used or were used by other researchers that came to have consultations with the data or data science librarian. And then last but not least, right now there is a growing list of online resources at GitHub. And so as you have access to these slides, you can also access that list. And on this particular GitHub list, there are a series of APIs that are categorized based on use and the type of research or type of data that's that's encompassed in each one. So to get us started, since we have just such a few number of people, I'd like you all first, if you have the slides pulled up, to go ahead and click that search engine approach, but I'm going to do the same thing. And basically what we're looking for is we want the US state population and API. That's all I typed in. And so when I do that, I start to see the Census Bureau as the #1 API that's available. This goes along perfectly with what we're expecting because the United States Census Bureau is the department that is responsible for understanding population data, population estimates at each level in the United States, including states, counties, cities, and towns. But let's just go ahead and maybe scroll through because maybe sometimes the first choice that you get maybe isn't the one that you want to use. So we can just do a quick scroll through of the other options that are available. So as we keep scrolling through, you begin to notice that multiple people are interested in the Census API or recommending the Census API, including Brown University. We'll talk a little bit more, but Dr. Walker has created a R package that will allow us to really collect Census Bureau data using the API and translate it into digestible Excel spreadsheets or CSV spreadsheets that we can use downstream for analysis. And as you see here again, a tidy census package. And again, it's just pretty much summarizing different ways that we can use the US Census Bureau with different programming languages and different options. And so I'll go back to our presentation really quickly. The next thing that we want to look at is the university resources. Sorry, I just noticed that there were a few questions in the chat. If you need me, feel free to raise your hand or anything if you need me to repost those slides in the chat for you. However, with that being said, let's just take a quick look and see what are available with some of the university resources. For this particular presentation, I actually decided to focus on Temple's library because they have so many wonderful resources as well as a tutorial that explains what an API is. So after today's presentation, if you want to dive a little bit deeper, because right now we really are just doing an introduction on the more shallow end to what APIs are and how they can be used. But if you want to get a little bit more into their complexities and specifics for your research, this is a perfect resource and guide to kind of start with. And so in addition to talking about how to use APIs and what APIs are, they include a list of APIs for scholarly research. So we have the archives database. For those that aren't familiar with it, what archives is, it'll allow people to kind of put preprints of their research and some of the projects that they're working on while they're undergoing peer review. So that way we can stay abreast to new information. Because as you all heard previously in my slides, I talked about the fact that there's quite a turnaround sometimes between the submission of a publication and it being ready in the press. But if we have really pressing issues for our research that we're interested in, which in my case was outbreaks, the archives website allows us the opportunity to see a little bit quicker what research is going on, and that's currently been submitted for peer review. We have other things like the Biomed Central, which remember I talked about most of the scholarly and especially those that are open access journals that you're interested in, they're going to have an API that's available for you. For example, something that we do in science or in, I guess, all research sciences is doing things like literature reviews, or if you want to get a little bit more advanced with the statistics, being able to do what's called systematic literature review and meta-analysis. And so as you're doing that work, you may not want to go to the journal website and do a line by line search, page by page, to be able to pull out different resources that are relevant to your topic and what you're trying to write on. Instead, you can use the API and just readily pull those research articles based on a series of keywords that are relevant to your work. And so I won't go through all of these, but as you can kind of see, again, the major publishing resources are there. And then you have the major publishing journals are there. But then also you have a few data sets that may talk about what's going on globally and around the world. So we see this OECD. I've never used it myself, but it seems to be pretty encompassing of some of the top used data sets for different countries around the world as far as what's going on economically and probably from a population-based level too. And so then the last resource that we may want to use is the online list. And after we go through this online list, I want to take just a brief moment to kind of pause and maybe hear from the audience about some of the research topics that you all are working on and see if we can find a few APIs that are relevant to your work. So let's start with the online list that's currently being composed on GitHub. For you all that aren't familiar with GitHub, it's a website that basically has a lot of open repositories for data, sometimes even for code that you're interested in, that can be continuously updated for the public use. And so this particular one is a list of public APIs. And by public, we mean that they are free for use. I'll talk a little bit later in my presentation why we want to definitely take advantage of these free APIs, but just because we have so many free APIs doesn't mean all APIs are free, and that can cause a little bit of a hurdle sometimes for us when we're conducting our research. But as we can see first, just as I kind of mentioned before on this public list, we have all the different APIs by category. So for example, this is something I've never worked in, but maybe I'm interested in trying to figure out what type of APIs may be available for me to learn more about cryptocurrency or cryptocurrency data. And so once I click on that particular category for this long list or this public list, it allows me to get some basic information about the name of the API, a description of how it can be used or what it can be used for. And then there's a few more things here like authorization, HTTPS, and CORS that we'll talk about a little bit more as far as what we need when we're exploring these APIs. And so I'm going to briefly stop there. And I wanted to kind of hear from the different attendees as far as what projects you may be working on and seeing if maybe we can find some APIs that are useful for you all. I'm not sure if it's best for me to stop sharing in order to facilitate that conversation, or what do you think is best, Dr. Daniels?
I think you can continue to share as we facilitate the conversation. Yes.
All right, perfect. Because at least I can see my screen, but I can't really see the chat or if people are verbally.
I'll run to the chat for you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
And one comment is from Danielle Cooper. Dr. Cooper is, I'm interested in justice data.
Okay. Oh, this will be a good one. Okay. Do you have a specific type of justice that you're interested in?
Youth justice, sex offender registry, and police brutality.
All right. Now, okay, Dr. Cooper, this one might give us a little bit of a hardship, I'm sure, because you probably know from your research that a lot of this data is protected information. It's something that I've recently been running into with the research project, but let's just go ahead and see what maybe the Department of Justice has available for us, and specifically with their National Crime Victimization Survey. Okay, and so I will put this in the chat for you as well if you want to explore it a little bit later.
And Dr. Coates, we see a static screen. I don't know if that's your intent.
Oh, you see a static screen. Okay.
Yes.
Let me stop my share and maybe let me just share my screen in its entirety. Are you all able to see it a little bit better now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and previously when I was kind of walking through the other APIs, were you able to see that, or do I need to?
That was static. It was a static screen, yes.
Oh, okay. I will go
better.
back through those then, just so that everyone can see after we talk about this. But so there is an API available for this particular data source. And let's see what information they might have available for us. All right. So at least we have, it seems at select person level, they have information about the population size, as well as personal crime victimization. So that includes things like rape and sexual assault, robbery, aggravated and simple assault, and then also some household data for those same variables. So I'm not sure, Dr. Cooper, if this may meet some of your research needs, but if it does, let's look and see as far as what some of these access instructions may be. All right. So, so these are one of the things when it comes to APIs, depending on what your expertise is or what your use needs are. So for me, the reason why I was a little bit hesitant when you mentioned this was because I tend to like to use things at the command line. And right now it doesn't appear that this information is available to be able to interact with something like R or Python, but you can use a URL just in your regular internet service provider. For example, if you're using Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge, to be able to type in the information that you're interested in. And it can return a maximum of 1,000 records for a given year that you can then convert very easily, it seems like, between either a JSON, XML, or CSV file. Depending on what some of your research needs are, I personally preferred things to be in a CSV file format. But when it comes to APIs, quite a bit will get those JSON files. But again, we'll talk about how to do some of those conversions really quickly and really easily. And so with that, one thing I want to do is I just want to quickly go back and show you all those lists that I had mentioned before now that you can actually see my screen. And so now that you can actually see the screen, this is the GitHub public API that I had mentioned. And again, it includes basically, depending on what research topics you're interested in, a variety of different APIs that could be available to you. So before we kind of talked about the cryptocurrency, but just because maybe I'm a little biased, I'm going to go to some of our science and math APIs and see what may be available. And so when you're at that particular category now, as you can see a little bit better than before, it's going to give you the name of the API, the description to get an idea of if this is even useful for you. You may already have data sources that you commonly use, so you can explore and search within this list to see if they're available. And then it lets you know if there's authorization that's needed. We'll talk in a few slides about what exactly that means, whether or not you can access it through using a URL, and if the CORS information is available. Again, just quickly showing you all the Temple University research information that their library has assembled about how to use APIs and specifically for scholarly resources. A lot of the information they have assembled is pretty specific to research journals that you may be interested in or may be commonly using. A case example that you could really use APIs to shorten some of your time. Something that I used to do, I used to use what was called PubCrawler, and PubCrawler would look for certain keywords that I had established, and every week let me know if there was new research articles. Now with an API, you don't have to go through that external source. You can pretty much run either your HTTPS URL on a weekly basis yourself, or if you want to assemble code to be able to write and let you know when any new research articles on your topic come out, you can do that as well. An alternative source or not alternative, but an alternative way you may use a lot of these for some of the journals like Elsevier and so forth is when you're writing your systematic reviews or your literature reviews. But basically, I just wanted to show for this particular library resource and for many library resources, they're going to kind of talk about more scholarly journals and how to use APIs specifically to be able to pull those research articles, especially those open access research articles. And so the first method, of course, that we talked about before was just good old-fashioned Google search, saying whatever your topic is interested in. That's the approach that we use to be able to find this particular API. So typing in whatever you're interested in, plus the word API, and it's going to return some of those top choices or top resources that you can use. Based on Dr. Cooper's research topic, we see a lot of things from the Department of Justice as far as a government organization. Don't believe Queensland is going to be, yes, that's not going to be US data, but if you are interested in data outside of the US, there are some sources. And then it looks like specifically there are some smaller government organizations like the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, and it looks like even DC that has publicly available data on crime and justice. With maybe a little bit more searching, depending on what your needs are, Dr. Cooper, you likely could probably find an API specific to your area. Now, if you're trying to look for things that are really small population sizes, I'm sure you're familiar with this already, they may not be easily available on a public API just because that information could be considered sensitive or something that people would want to protect from just being easily available and readily available to anyone on the internet. And so,
Dr. Phelps, can I ask a question? What if we were looking for data on poverty? Let's say poverty or wealth, but poverty
yes.
specifically.
Okay. So poverty or wealth, the first thing that I think about is your, so you have your World Bank, but more specifically, the first thing that I would think of to see if it's here is the US Census, as well as the Department of Labor collects information on these. So let's see if we can do. Yeah. And so we have, let's see, I'm just going to go to the available Census Bureau API that will load for me. Okay. And so, for example, if you are interested in that information and we're looking at poverty statistics, we can see that they have an API that was last updated September 13th of 2022. And they give us a major description, which kind of, I guess, leads us into the next topic that I was going to talk about as far as documentation of what the sources are for this particular type of data. And there should be information on, and information on how to make an API call for poverty status, and some of the other variables that might be of interest for you. So you have things that understand this information based on race categories, and there should be a little bit more. There should be something as well as, at least in the past when I've used this API, been able to pull information in regards to education level and attainment and how that impacts poverty status. But that is one of the things that the Census Bureau does a pretty good job of collecting information on. And so being able to accurately use that API for the Census Bureau, you can get a wealth of data when it comes to information on poverty. And so just before I move on to the next slide, are there any other questions that people from the audience may have before we proceed?
There are no other questions in the chat.
All right, so I will go on to, did I lose I lost where we were at. All right, that's okay. So as you kind of saw, at least for me and anyone who's doing this type of research, you want to make sure that you read your API documentation. That's going to be the first step after you found the API. The documentation, if written appropriately, should answer any type of questions that you have, and it can be your first source to go to. And so basically this API documentation, there are going to be certain developers within each organization that works on creating the API. That documentation that they provide along with your API does not always, but it should succinctly explain what you can do with the API, what you can't do, and how to get yourself started. So at some of the APIs that we've looked at already, as far as their documentation, it gives us an idea of what data sets are available, what variables may be available. And also, we haven't gone into it yet, we will in just one second, but how to make a request using that API. So how can we turn that API into that waiter that we talked about before? When you're looking at your API documentation, there's a few things that you're going to want to automatically look for. If you remember when we were looking at that GitHub example, one of the first columns that was there was auth, A-U-T-H. That is short for authentication. So we have a lot of valuable data here. Some of it is publicly and easily available, but there are also some malicious uses that can go along with that. So a way to kind of prevent that is through authentication for APIs. And what this is it's basically like a security system that a lot of these organizations have put into place. It lets them know who's using this data, and are they authorized to do so? And it also allows them to put a limit on how much data you're pulling and how frequently you're pulling it. And so the most common way that organizations will do this is through having you register for an API key. This API key is a secret code that is generated using your account specific information. So you'll likely have either an email address that you connect to your API, some sort of username, but basically something that lets them be able to say, all right, Dr. Coates is the person who made 10,000 calls to the Census Bureau API today to try to find out information about population dynamics in 12 rural counties in Georgia. And so this is really nice because a lot of times if there's a public API, registration is free and it's simple, but sometimes they might be behind a paywall. So an example that has recently happened is with Twitter's API. A lot of people were using Twitter's API to be able to access information about what people were online talking about. Were people online talking about COVID cases and the impact that it had on their area? Were people online sharing information about symptoms they may be having in locations that they were visiting to kind of help do targeted contact tracing? And in the case of kind of justice data for Dr. Cooper, sometimes people will actually use Twitter data to see if people of a certain age group are having more violent tweets or talking about more violent events in their area, because that can have an impact on their mental health and long-term health. But one of the most important things to think about this API key is it is a secret code that is specific for you or your organization. So you never want to share this information publicly, and you never want to share it with someone who isn't a trusted source, because if they do something negatively or maliciously with that API code, the consequences could fall back on the particular person that it's registered to. Also, when we're looking at our API documentation, we're looking for what some people summarize as an object. And basically the object is really representing the information that's available when we use the API. So you can kind of think about it in the classical sense as objects in records or in database tables, but a description of the objects that are in the database tables. So when you look at that particular object information, you can get an idea about the data attributes, the type, description, and metadata. So for example, if I'm interested in pulling raw count data, so raw count data, as you can think about, is just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how many people in this particular community are African American? If I want to pull that specific information versus someone who might want to pull information that's been more normalized, or a percentage saying, for example, 50% of that population identify as female or women, or maybe you want to find out that maybe 12% of the population is below the poverty line. That is stuff that you can easily identify and understand when looking at the objects, and to know if the information or the data that they're providing is actually relevant. Something else that you really want to try to look at is the description. So if I'm specifically looking for population data, I want to go to the description and make sure that it says that this is population data. This is count population data that I can use for my research purposes, because there's nothing worse than spending a lot of time trying to figure out an API and then pulling information from the API only to realize that this isn't what I need, or this doesn't allow me to accomplish the objective that I set out for myself. And so the next thing we want to look at is the request format. So we talked about previously the waiter example. You go into a restaurant, you have a specific request or a specific meal that you would like to get made a certain way. So for example, for me, I have a tomato allergy. So if I go to a restaurant, I want to make sure that it wasn't prepared near tomatoes and there aren't any tomatoes in my meal. So I have to make sure that I let the waiter know that, and I make that request so that they can let the chef know before the plate comes back to me on the table. The same thing is true for an API, but each API has a specific way you have to ask, right? So I'm from the South. We have this place called Waffle House, and you get hash browns scattered, you get scattered, covered, smothered, all different ways, right? And so at that particular restaurant, they have a specific way that they look to get the information from you and translate it to the cook. The same thing is true for the API. And within that documentation, if the documentation is written appropriately, it should give you a specific format that you have to use to be able to get the information the way that you would like to see it. And then we also have response codes. So today we're going to successfully run our API because we have a pretty dummy-proof example, but sometimes I've tried to run APIs and I've gotten error codes or I've gotten issues like, for example, the information is no longer available, or they decided to put it behind a paywall, or maybe for example, I was trying to pull Census Bureau data one time and I left out one of the S's in census. So I got an error to say that it couldn't load. When you're looking in your API documentation, you want to see if they have any information available about the response codes that will be generated, because that will let you know when it comes to troubleshooting or anything downstream, if you put in your API request and you're not able to get the output that you were looking for, what happened and how to potentially fix that. Some other important information that can be provided in the API includes the API endpoints. So the endpoint is kind of, if you think about it, your final result. And so you want to be able to understand what exactly is available to you. You want to understand how that information is going to be returned to you, which is called the response format. So, for example, we've kind of seen before that the APIs could return information either as an XML file, a .csv file, which is kind of similar to an Excel file and what most of us probably are really interested in, or they could return it as a JSON file, which is still usable, but takes a little tweaking for a lot of us to use as research scientists. And then finally, the client libraries. Depending on what your needs and goals are, you may be interested in using a programming language to pull that information and automatically be able to do your data analysis and visualizations. And so for a lot of these APIs, specifically those that are government APIs, they already have developed package ways for you to integrate that API into programming languages like R and Python. So we're going to give it a try by visiting the Census API documentation and see what information we may find. Okay, I guess the link is not live, so I will have to share it with you all, but that's okay. Okay, and I'm going to place this in the chat for everyone as well. And while I'm doing this, just to make sure, are there any questions or comments that you all might have? Okay. So for me, the first thing that I like to do is try to see if there's anything about authentication. Is there anything, do I need an API key to even get myself started? And so for the Census Bureau, this information is kind of represented towards the end. And the reason why is because traditionally with the Census Bureau, if you're just making, a call for one variable like we're doing today, and you're not, let's say you want the population data for 2019, and you only need it one time. Census is not going to require you to have an API for that information. But as we mentioned before, sometimes things can get really complex, right? So for example, when I was working on the project that required me to use the Census API, I had to pull multiple variables. So I had to pull the population, I needed to pull income data, I needed to pull who had access to computers, I needed to understand things about their educational attainment, and it can get really big after a while. So if you have up to maybe 50 variables and you want to make about more than 500 calls, then you're going to need the API key, because they're going to want to have a little bit of idea of who's making this, who needs this much data and this frequently. And so the way that you can do that with the census information is on their developer's website. It's a really, me too. Not good. Does anybody know, that little top bar that's in the way when you're on Zoom, how to make that disappear? Maybe I can just.
You can hit yeah, you may be able to hit escape and be able to find your browser.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, all right.
All right. So these tools, APIs, they were first used by developers. So in the beginning, I kind of mentioned the idea of how the weather app uses APIs to be able to put that information publicly available for you. But as research scientists, we can kind of, instead of making an app, we can just download that information in CSV files for us to use. And so if you're going to make a huge call to something like the Census Bureau, they're going to want you to request a key. So you can see it's pretty simple. They just want your organization's name and your email address, and that you are kind of agreeing to their terms of service. So as far as the Census Bureau goes, this is publicly available information collected using taxpayer dollars. So they want to make sure that you're not doing things that are for profit based on the information that they provided for you. And so when you enter this, I've already done so myself. I already have an API key. But for the Census Bureau, as long as there's nothing that comes up, and especially if you're using a research organization or an academic organization, as long as there's nothing that comes up as a red flag about that particular organization, then your key gets approved and you normally have access within a couple of minutes to maybe an hour at the most. And that hour at the most is more than likely an extreme exaggeration, because I don't think I've ever had to take that long to get access to my API key. And so that kind of helps us with our first objective, is just understanding what the authentication process is. The next thing that we want to look at is the object or the data information. So I'll go to the next slide, but then I'll also go back to the Census API documentation. But for us specifically, we're going to want to look for a data set that has population estimates and projections. And specifically, we're looking at a variable for the total population. So we'll take a quick moment to just kind of look through the Census Bureau documentation and see what we can find in regards to the objects that are available. So the way that we can do that for this particular API, which is very well written, it includes the available data sets that they have using the API. So you have your American Community Survey that's given on a 1-year, 5-year basis, as well as some of the supplemental data. You can have economic indicators, as well as the decennial, I'm probably mispronouncing that word, census, which is a census survey that's given every 10 years, economic census, and as you see more information about county business patterns and non-employer statistic, international trade. But for us, that population estimates and projections is what we're most interested in. And then also, they give you information about variables. So with the Census API, as well as with other APIs, they have variable names that they use to understand each one of these, but they may not always be translated in lay language. So for example, if I said B01003_001E, if you're not used to working with this data, or this is your first time using the API, that means absolutely nothing to you. But once you get more familiar with it and you have a chance to kind of explore within the Census Bureau, the different data sets that they have describing their variables, you'll come to realize that this is a type of table. So B is a type of table that they refer to. The number is specific to the population, and then E is the estimate. And so we want to make sure that we know what that particular variable is that we're interested in and how to be able to call it. Now, something that Census and some other API sources have begun doing is trying to get more meaningful or more easily understandable names. So also when we look at the total population in some of their data sets and API calls, we can just use the term POP or POP. All right, and so then the next thing is the request format. We're going to start out with just using the URL to be able to pull this information. And so specifically for the Census API, they have a .gov website. They specifically want us to say that we're using data, but these are some things that we're going to change just a little bit. The year is something that we can input. I'm not sure when the census started, but it's been around for quite some time. So there's a variety of years that you can pull information from. The dataset name acronym. So previously, when we were looking at the object, you all saw all the different data sets that they had available, ACS1, 5, the decennial. We want to get the acronym to be able to say specifically, I want information from this data set. Then we're going to use a slash and a question mark get, and that's going to be equal to the variable name that we're interested in. And then lastly, we have to input the geography or the region that we want. And so I know we are a little bit short on time, so I'm gonna, you can definitely explore the Census API documentation, but I'm just gonna kind of say for us today, we're gonna pull year 2019. We want the population table, the population variable, and we're specifically gonna look for this for states. Next is the response codes. So for this particular one, I was really interested in what the format would be, because if it's in a format maybe that I don't find the most useful, I need to figure out either through the API how I can get it in the most useful format, or if there are any external tools that I can use to convert it. So for the Census API, its default output is going to be a JSON file. And we'll see an example in just 1 second of what a JSON file is for those who may not be familiar with it. But for me as a researcher, I'm really used to Excel. So I want it in a .csv file. And potentially I might convert that .csv file into an Excel file. And so then the last but not least, for those of you all who might be programmers, there are 2 packages. First, the Tidy Census package in R. That's a package that will let you automatically pull information using the API. And I will share some example code of how to do that before the conclusion of our presentation. And then there's the Census 0.5 package in Python. That package might be considered a little bit dated for a lot of people, but Python has continuously updated it, and there are some new, I guess you can just call it by the name, census packages that you can use in Python to be able to do the same type of analysis that we were doing in R. So the ability to be able to pull the data using the API, assemble it into a usable data format, and then go ahead and do your analysis and visualization. So for us, this would be the following API link that we would put into our internet service provider to be able to get us that 2019 state population data for the United States. And so, so I may have to copy and paste that. I thought I had it as a live link. So if I copy and paste this into my browser, it returns the following JSON file. And so as you can see, for a JSON file, it includes at first in brackets each one of our variables. So the name of the state, the population, and a number that is assigned to the state. And then for each exact state, we have the name, for example, Mississippi, the total population, and an identifying number. But maybe I don't know how to use this information for my downstream analysis. So thankfully, something that's also included in the Census API is how to convert that JSON file, or a link to a website that will allow you to convert that JSON file into a .csv or Excel file. This resource is free, so as you can notice, there are lots of ads that pop up, but it is a reliable and trusted source. So for example, what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to copy everything that was just shared and paste it into this frame, into this, and select the output. I may want, do I want a CSV file or do I want it as an Excel? I'm going to do Excel just because we tend to like Excel files. And now as I download it and open it, I now have an Excel file that includes each one of the variables that I mentioned before and the information so that I can easily use this to be able to do any other analysis that I had planned. And so for some of you all, you may be more programming ready. And so if that's the case, R has a package that is continuously updated by Dr. Walker called Tidy Census. And what this particular package will let you do, will let you use the US Census Bureau's decennial census, as well as their 5-year American Community Survey results, and return that into a tidyverse ready data frame, which can let you do quite a bit as far as GIS and data analytics a whole lot easier than it used to be with having to download the data and then also get it ready using a lot of backline coding in R. And so if you're able to do that or you want to do that, it's a pretty simple, especially if we're only pulling one variable like we did. You're going to install and import the packages that you need. You're going to, in order to be able to use these packages, this is when you also are going to need an API key. So once you register for your API key, you can insert that into your code. And for us, if I wanted to pull a variable of the population in 2020, basically I would do get decennial, which is a reference to the survey that I'm interested in. Now I need to state the geography, which is still states, and the variables. One of the really awesome things about this is we only have one variable that we're interested in pulling. But if you create a list with your different variables in it, up to 50 variables, you can easily pull this in one line of code and in just in a matter of seconds. And when I say a matter of seconds, if it takes you more than 2 minutes to pull 50 variables from each one of the states or even possibly each one of the counties in the US using this code, something's gone terribly wrong. And so when I say it pulls very quickly, it's amazing just how quickly you can pull this information. And thankfully, the same thing is available if you use Python. And so some of the data sets that are available are going to be slightly different with the Python API. From my personal experience, if you have R coding experience and knowledge, that's going to be the code or the package that you use, just because there's been a lot more development on the R side when it comes to census data. But if you prefer Python, because maybe you want to do something like machine learning, you can definitely use the census package. 0.819 is the most up to date, but you can also use census 0.5 if you're interested in pulling maybe older data or from a wider array of data sets. But basically, this package will allow you to have access to your ACS data sets. That includes the 1 and 5 year, and as well as some of the supplemental files that go along with that information. And the code is pretty much, it's really simple and pretty similar to that in R and even in that API key that we used at the URL. You're going to install and import the packages that you need. In this case, we're going to import the census package and also a package that's called US. That US package kind of helps with, if you've ever done like GIS data and you need information about states, latitude, longitude, specifics for that, that's what that US package is going to really help you with. Again, though, you're going to need a census key to be able to integrate the API with some of these programming languages. But again, it's pretty standard code. You're going to have the name of the data set, the particular variable that you're interested in. Again, if you want to have more than one variable, you can do that really easily at the command line. And you're going to include which geography and which year that you're interested in. You're trying to pull this information. And so I know we're out of time, so I'll do this next part really quickly. I've kind of already hinted at them, but the Census API is a beautiful API that is well documented, but all APIs aren't created equally. Some of the difficulties that can arise is right now in the field, there's not a set of standards of what is considered good documentation. The developers that are working on it include what they believe to be good documentation, but from organization to organization, this can be inconsistent. And sometimes some of the important details that you need can be omitted. And if that's the case, some of those things that we mentioned before, like the authentication, the object, and so forth, if those happen to be missing, then you have to probably reach out to the organization or the developers themselves and set up independent training sessions or seminars to really understand how to navigate this information a little bit more. Getting credentials. So I've hinted at it a few times. Public APIs, they're my go-to source. They're convenient, they're cost-effective, and they're free. But as we continue to enter into a world of more data collection, people are realizing the price or the value behind data. So there are APIs that we commonly use that now are no longer free and are behind paywalls. And the example that I've kind of been using before is that Twitter API. Now, in order to use some of these data APIs, you have to get approval, which can require additional funding, or more likely, if you're working at a university or a major research organization, getting support from them to see if that this is something that multiple investigators or researchers at your institution want to use, really investing in that university support and access to the API. And so that's all I have for today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just because I'd love to at least be able to see faces. But I will take any questions with the time that we have remaining.
Dr. Coates, I don't see any questions in the chat currently.
Okay, and then everyone has the slides, but if you have any other questions, or if you ever wanted to maybe set up a one-on-one call about how to use APIs, please feel free to reach out to me via my email or LinkedIn. And again, if you want, I can also put that in the chat for everybody if that's a little bit easier.
Thank you, and I did reshare the slides from earlier, so the participants are set there. Really want to thank you. What an informative session. I feel like I know more about APIs, and I'm going to continue to delve into the topic and learn more as well. So you may receive a call from me. So we really want to appreciate you and thank you for your time today.
All right, thank you, everybody, and thank you for bearing with me as I went over. Sorry about that.
No, thank you very much. Very good information. And I'm just going to put the link to the survey in the chat again. If you would, please complete the survey. We would appreciate it. And Dr. Coates, again, thank you, and look forward to talking again soon.
Awesome. And best of luck with everyone in their research efforts, especially you, Dr. Cooper. When I tell you some of that social justice data has given me a headache trying to get beyond the security areas to really get the information I need. So best of luck as you pursue that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.